He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of... Huh? The sound was jerked out of him, as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes that it always had imagined, but never actually seen out of the basement. It's an animal, he thought incoherently. That's all it is, some animal. Maybe a house cat that got stuck down there. Still, he was ready to run. Wouldn't run in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface on the macadam under his fingers, and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hiya, Georgie," it said. Georgie blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie. You know, like when the animals will talk and dance. If it had been 10 years older, he would have not believed what he was seeing. But he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough to see that Georgie Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. He was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle. He talked by honking, or was it her? Georgie was never sure really of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just out about the only one who could understand Clarabelle, and that always cracked Georgie up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head. There was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If Georgie had been happening a year later, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Clozo or Clarabelle. The clown had a bunch of balloons, all colors, like gorgeous ripe fruit in one hand. In the other was Georgie's newspaper boat. "Do you want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. Georgie smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was a kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward. Then he drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How Georgie wondered. Could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright, dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes, and Bill's. "Very wise indeed, Georgie. Therefore, I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise, the dancing clown. Pennywise, meet Georgie Denbrough. Georgie, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct?" Georgie giggled. "I guess so." He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. "How did you get down here?" "The storm just blew me away," Pennywise the dancing clown said. "It blew the whole circus away." "Can you smell the circus, Georgie?" Georgie leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts, hot roasted peanuts and vinegar, the white kind you put on your french fries, through a hole in the cap. he could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys, and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cherry aroma of Midway sawdust, and yet under it all was the smell of flood and decomposing leaves in the dark, store-trimmed shadows. The smell was wet and rotten. The cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. "You bet I can smell it," he said. "What's your book, Georgie?" Pennywise asked. "I only repeat myself because you really do not seem eager." He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great orange buttons, a bright tie. Electric blue flopped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves, the kind that Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. "Yes, sure." "And a balloon? I've got red and green and yellow and blue." "Do they float?" "Float?" The clown's grin widened. "Oh, yes. Indeed they do. They float, and there's cotton candy." Georgie reached. The clown seized his arm, and Georgie saw the clown's face change. What he saw was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings, a thing in the cellar, look sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed any sanity in one clawing stroke. "They float." The thing in the drain crooned in a clotted, chuckling voice. It held Georgie's arm in its thick, wormy grip. It pulled Georgie towards the terrible darkness, where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris towards the sea. Georgie craned his neck away from the final blackness and began to scream in the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing, and all the way up and down Witcham Street, the people came to their windows, bolted out on their porches. "They float," it growled. "They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float too." Georgie's shoulder socked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job at the shoe boat that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker, a small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter with muddy water surfing over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. Everything down here floats," that chuckling, rotten voice whispered, and suddenly there was a ripping noise and a flaring sheet of agony, and Georgie Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get here, and although he arrived only 45 seconds later at the first scream, Georgie Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker and pulled him into the street and began to scream himself as Georgie's body turned over in his hands. The left side of Georgie's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave staggered away towards the others, already running pell-mell down to the street, they began to fill up with rain. Somewhere below in the storm drain that was already filled nearby capacity with runoff, there could have been no one down there. The county sheriff would later exclaim to Derry. News reporters with a frustrated fury, so great it almost agony Hercules himself would have been swept away in that driving current. Georgie's newspaper boat shot onward through the nighted chambers of the long green halls that roared and chimed with water for a while and ran neck and neck with a dead chicken that floated with its yellowy reptile toes pointed at the dripping ceiling. Then, at some junction east of town, a chicken was swept off to the left while Georgie's boat went straight. An hour later, while Georgie's mother was being sedated in the emergency room at Dairy Home Hospital, while stuttering Bill sat stunned in the white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob hoarsely, in the parlor where his mother had been playing Phil Ellis. When Georgie went out, the boat shot out through a concrete loophole like a bullet exiting a muzzle of a gun, and ran its speed down the sluiceway and into an unnamed street. When it joined the boiling, swollen Penobscot River 20 minutes later, the first rifts of blue had begun to show in the sky overhead. The storm was over. The boat dipped and swayed and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two brothers had waterproofed it well. I did not know where it finally fetched up, if ever did, perhaps reached the sea and sails forever like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat, still running on the breast of the flood. And when it passed the unincorporated town limits of Derry, Maine, and there it passes out of this tale.